Each version of Street Fighter 3 looks very similar on a surface level, but in reality they're pretty much completely different games. From gameplay, visual, audio, and presentation differences, each version has many unique qualities that are offered to the player, but what about the stuff that didn't make it into these games? Game development is usually a long and very challenging process, and it's extremely common for developers to not be able to include everything they wanted to in the initial planning stages. Technical issues, budget concerns, and time constraints are usually the main culprits as to why things are cut from games, and the Street Fighter series is no different. Thankfully, people have spent the last decade or so exploring the files of the Street Fighter 3 games, and they found some super interesting things. From UI differences to cut characters, there is a lot to cover in this video. I will also be covering things that weren't cut per se, but were altered heavily over time. As a disclaimer, I may miss some things here and there due to how obscure some of this information can be, so if I've left anything out that you're passionate about, leave a comment below. I'm also using the Cutting Room Floor and Flying Omelette websites as my sources, so if you'd like to learn more about all this cut content, then check these websites out. Alright, without further ado, let's get into the cut content of New Generation. Due to Street Fighter 3 New Generation being the very first game in the Street Fighter 3 sub-series, it has the most amount of cut content, as the developers had to start from scratch for this brand new game. Let's begin with the game's pre-release differences. The first one I'd like to show is the original character select screen on the left here. This original image is very low quality, so I've had to upscale it for us to see it better. At first glance, it looks nearly identical to the final character select screen. The characters on the bottom are in the same positions, and the background looks very similar to the final game's background. What is different, however, are Necro and Ryu's portraits. While Necro's portrait looks very similar, we can see that his eyes aren't glowing yellow, and Ryu's portrait is completely different. Ryu's facial expression was completely changed in the final game, and it looks like he's looking directly at Necro here. The text at the top is also a different color with an uneven silver to dark grey gradient as opposed to the vertical yellow to orange gradient with the pink outline featured in the final game. The game's HUD also had a few different appearances before the developers settled on the final one, and we'll go through them all in order. Pre-release Build 1's HUD looks completely different to the final game. The health bars look different, and the stun bars are directly above the character portraits. Speaking of character portraits, Ryu's Player 1 portrait here is facing left as opposed to facing right like in the final game, and despite being nearly finished, Yoon doesn't even have a portrait. Instead, he just has this empty blue square. The super meters on the bottom look different too, and we can also see some debug related text above the super numbers, which I think was information relating to character coordinates. This build was shown off in Capcom Friendly Club Volume 3, which was a Japanese series of VHS tapes that Capcom fans could order to see behind the scenes footage of new games. Thanks to the Internet Archive for this one, because I was able to find a rip of this VHS tape online in decent quality. While I can't understand any of it due to being a gaijin, it's still awesome that we can see some very early footage of the game in motion. Apologies for all the camera shaking by the way, it's just part of the video and there's really nothing I can do about it. Oh yeah, before I forget, it's a minor detail, but the wavy background that appears when you perform a super art also looks a bit different to the super art background in the final game. Also, we can see that the game doesn't have win quotes yet, as well as having different colors for the text on the win screen. Moving on to pre-release build 2, I managed to find 2 screenshots of this build. We can see in these that player 1 portraits are now facing to the left, and it looks more polished overall. Characters have this cool looking red shape near the icons at the top, and the meter numbers at the bottom also have a stylized shape associated with them. We can also see that in the screenshot with Alex and Ibuki, the meter numbers change color when you build up a bar, which also happens in the final game. Pre-release build 3 looks nearly identical to the final game, but I did notice that instead of having a purple to blue health bar gradient, this build has a dark to light blue gradient. Due to how old this game is, it's no surprise that finding pre-release footage for New Generation that isn't on the sites I mentioned before is very difficult, but I've done my best. Alright, let's move on to things that are in the game's files but not accessible by normal means. If you set the game's region value to 0x9y, the game will enable a widescreen mode. New Generation's widescreen is completely finished, but according to the Cutting Room Floor, there is a small amount of visual glitching on the Versus screen, although I'm unable to find footage of what this looks like. Also, as a little thing that I think is funny, there is a graphic in the game files of what appears to be a ghost from Pac-Man as a placeholder of sorts. Moving on to the really good stuff now. Did you know that Hugo is in the game files? There's a value in the game's code called 200EB43, and if you set it to 06, then you can use Hugo. He is nowhere near complete, as his normals aren't in the game and his sprite goes from looking good to unfinished, with lots of noticeable outlining. His stun bar is also ridiculously long, and his super art select looks really glitchy. His supers also have different names too. Giant Pile Driver, Titan Riot, and Hyper Knuckle are Gigas Breaker, Megaton Press, and Hammer Frenzy respectively. Hugo's second impact stage is also in the New Generation files, but it does use the music from Gil's stage. The Versus screen also says this stage is in Moscow, which is incorrect, because Hugo is German, so therefore his stage is in Germany. This is because in the game's code, Necro's bit number is 04 and Hugo's is 05. Due to Hugo being one above Necro, I believe this is why the Moscow text appears. Finally, there are also some unused audio files. There are clips of the announcer mentioning Gil, and while you can hear these in the Street Fighter 3 Double Impact game on Dreamcast where you can play as him normally, these are unheard in the arcade release of New Generation unless you use hacks to force the game to let you play as Gil.
Gil wins.
Finally, there is also a short rendition of Jingle Bells in the game files. Covering Second Impact means that we've now entered the cut audio part of the video. Unlike New Generation, I wasn't able to find any images of Second Impact's pre-release builds, but I did manage to find lots of unused audio files in the game. Let's start with leftover sounds from New Generation. Since Second Impact is essentially an update to New Gen, it makes sense that some of that game's audio made its way into Second Impact.
New Generation.
Also, you know how Second Impact has that parry minigame where you have to parry the basketballs thrown at you by Sean? In the final game, this is strictly a single-player minigame, but there are unused audio files that indicate that this minigame was, at one point, planned to be multiplayer, much like the car minigame in Street Fighter 2.
1P win! 2P win! Judgment!
The last one is my favorite, not only because I think it sounds really funny, but also because having Judgment be used to determine who won a parry the basketball battle sounds amazing. There's also audio of an unused character, and believe it or not, I think this belongs to Makoto. But Carnage, I hear some of the more rabid commenters shout. Makoto wasn't in Second Impact, my waifu made her debut in Third Strike, how could you get this wrong, you idiot? Look, according to a developer interview called The Making of Street Fighter 3 Third Strike on shmuplations.com, the main planner of Third Strike, Hidetoshi Ishizawa, stated that Makoto was planned for Second Impact and that her design was finished, but they ran out of time to properly include her.
さあ、始めましょうはぁいやいや
The loud, energetic nature of the lines you heard before match Makoto's character perfectly, and I can imagine the "Hi-ya" line to play when she does her chop special. As far as I know, Makoto is the only cut character to have audio left over in the game files, but I imagine that there were other characters planned for the game that never made it in too. Let's move on to the characters who did make it in now. Akuma has an unused line of him using his air fireball. Ken has 4 unused lines, with the last one making it into Marvel vs. Capcom 1 during one of Ryu's fight intros.
こいつが相手だ遠慮はいらないぜ見てな頼むぜ
Elena has a line of her saying, I feel the spirits.
I feel the spirit.
Urien has a line of him saying, Yokoso Shin no Teiyu, which translates into English as Welcome the New Emperor.
ようこそ真の帝王
And Yang has a bunch of sounds that play when he gets hit. There are also some interesting regional differences with blood being changed from red to green, or being removed entirely in Urien's case, but this isn't cut content per se, it's just cultural differences, but I still think it's really interesting. Moving on to Third Strike means that we'll be continuing the trend of listening to cut audio, but there's also some bigger bits and pieces here too. For starters, as a leftover from Second Impact, if you set the $20111387 value in the game's code to 0F, then you can play as Shin Akuma. He's mostly functional, although he can't perform Akuma's KKZ Super due to that move not being in Second Impact. Shin Akuma is found above Ryu on the character select screen, and he has a bunch of gameplay differences when compared to the regular Akuma found in normal Third Strike. He has no grab whiff animation, he has a double fireball, he can't combo light kick into itself which prevents him from doing 2 crouching light kicks into Super Art 1, his dive kick comes out instantly, he has a faster low forward, doing medium tatsu into DP is a lot more consistent, he has no demon flips, his heavy DP is faster and has a different parry pattern, and his projectiles are also faster. The cutting room floor also states that winning with him displays Chun-Li's portrait, but I found a video from a channel called Ultimate Player TAS, and this looks fine to me, so I don't really know. Speaking of leftovers from Second Impact, Third Strike also has that game's widescreen mode, albeit an unfinished version. We can clearly see that the HUD and other visual elements are misaligned, but I don't think it affects actual gameplay, which is really good. By the way, if you set the Shin Akuma value from before to 00, you can actually play as Gil, and he's found towards the bottom left of the character select screen. He has 3 supers like everyone else, but his SA3 symbol is left blank when you hover over it. Resurrection and Meteor Strike have been translated into English, although the latter has a typo in the word Meteor. Just like the final boss skill, you have access to all 3 supers at any given time, so it doesn't really matter which one you pick before the match starts. His win icon is also corrupted and the colours don't display right. It kind of looks like something out of a really bad mid-2010s creepypasta. Before we wrap up, I'd like to cover some more cut audio. As a disclaimer, I won't be playing all of the cut audio like before, due to there being way too many cut 12 lines using his X-Copy super. All you need to know is that since 12 can't use EX moves or start the round with X-Copy, all lines relating to these 2 features are unused. If you do want to listen to them, then look up the Third Strike page on the Cutting Room Floor website, because they're all easily accessible there. There are 3 scrapped lines of the iconic announcer, voiced by Canadian rapper Infinite, who also performed the game's vocal tracks, and they were meant to be used for when you performed badly in the parry minigame,
You need to practice more.
when you lost a fight,
Don't you want a rematch?
and when you gained a bar of meter.
Super Art ready.
Urien and Alex have unused lines for when they start a battle,
You've got no chance.
I'm ready.
Ken has an unused line of him shouting the name of his Super Art 3,
Sippu Sinlaikak!
Gil has a line for when he does his Resurrection Super,
Witness my light eternal.
and while this next one is still in the game, you can't hear it fully.
I am your god.
This line is heard in New Generation and Second Impact, but you can only hear it in Third Strike if you lose to Gil via Judgment, and even then, the line cuts off before he finishes speaking. As we've learnt, the Street Fighter 3 series has plenty of content that didn't make it into the final game, and if you learn something new about any of these games, then I'm very happy to hear that. I'd like to give a big shout out to the Cutting Room Floor and Flying Omelette once again for providing pictures and extensive details about the cut content of the series, Internet Archive for their Capcom VHS footage, and my friends Toe and Sleep Mode for helping me get Third Strike running with no music, and for translating Ken's cut lines respectively. Sleep Mode has a YouTube channel of his own, and if you like fighting game content covering all sorts of random games, then I highly recommend his stuff. There's no chance that I'd have been able to make this video without all of these sources, so definitely check them out if you'd like to see more cut content for other games too. I'd also like to thank you for watching this video if you made it all the way to the end, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.